you to Memorial Church this day on behalf of the rector who is away on a family event. It's very good to see you here today. I would ask members of Memorial to look around. If there are people you don't recognize, if there are visitors, please make them welcome and invite them back to church, invite them to take part in the life of Memorial. As you note from the intercessions, we are marking Pride Month. Today is the last day of Pride Month, but the rector and others have put together some reflections about gay life at Memorial Church, and so I will invite Miles to begin.
The 1970s. Under the leadership of its new rector, F. Lyman Barney Farnham, Memorial began a regular healing service on Wednesday evenings. Gradually, a number of community members began to attend, seeking prayers for healing and a safe space as they came to understand their own identity. With the leadership of individuals like Canon Ted Bennett, the Reverend Rovin Wernsdorfer, and others, Memorial became a safe, if quiet, space for gay men and women to worship and gather and know they were loved by God.
In the 1980s, with the advent of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, men began attending because they were struggling with a mysterious and challenging illness. Gradually, the service shifted to Sunday evenings and became an AIDS healing ministry. Parishioners like Tom Ahrens, Don Arendt, and Ken Turney were lay leaders of this service. Gradually, the diocese quietly adopted this as a diocesan AIDS ministry. Sometime in the late 1980s, it transitioned to take place at the cathedral. In 1985, an interfaith group came together to support ministry to men suffering with AIDS. Among the founders was Dr. Lois Eldred, now a member at Memorial. Canon Bennett, priest associate at Memorial, became the chairman of the AIDS Interfaith Network. A small group of Memorial members, including Pam Fleming, Louise Miller, Janine Baker Ruoff, and others, began a healing companion ministry, sitting with men in hospice dying of HIV/AIDS. At this point, there was no cure, nor even a treatment, and often hospitals would not accept AIDS patients, so many went through this process alone and estranged from family and friends. When asked whether she was scared, Pam Fleming replied, "Not as much as we should have been. We wore gloves, but mostly we just sat and prayed with people." Our current Partners in Care ministry is born out of the same sense of companionship and care for our neighbors. In the late 1980s, a new priest was called to Memorial, the Reverend Elizabeth Keaton. Elizabeth moved to Baltimore with her female partner and their children and was the first openly gay priest in Maryland. The Reverend Keaton was called in part because of her experience working with AIDS patients in Boston and led the AIDS service and the broader diocesan AIDS ministry. In recounting a story told by Janine Baker Ruoff, a member said she was sitting with Mr. Ahrens in his last days. He was staring into the distance and she asked, "What are you thinking about, Tom?" His response, "What I'm going to have for lunch." So much of this ministry was just offering a bit of normalcy amid chaos. Also of note, by the 1980s, Memorial was a safe space for gay and lesbian Episcopalians in the diocese in a variety of states of openness. Nancy Kelso, longtime member of Memorial, described Memorial at that time, "I always felt it was a receptive place. I couldn't assume the whole diocese was like us." That sense of welcome was also brought to the National Church when in 1985, a group of Marylanders led by Memorial Associate Rector Phoebe Coe sponsored a resolution establishing support ministries for the LGBT community in every diocese of the Episcopal Church.
1990s. By the 1990s, the AIDS ministry that began at Memorial was diocesan-wide and had at least a tacit support of the bishops. Treatment for HIV/AIDS were beginning to emerge, and more clergy and laity were coming out of the closet. Memorial was part of a larger initiative to establish a hospice, specifically for those dying of AIDS, the Joseph Ritchie House in the 800 block of North Utah Street. In 1992, Memorial took a huge risk, and on July 4th, a priest associate, the Reverend Bill Rich, conducted the first same-sex blessing inside a church in the state of Maryland, intended to be a private affair. It made front-page news in the Baltimore Sun. This was done with the knowledge and support of the Memorial Vestry and the rector. In truth, no one thought it was that big of a deal until it appeared on the front page of the newspaper. Despite previous tacit support for the service, Bishop A. Theodore Eastman punished Memorial and the Reverend Bill Rich and enacted a moratorium on similar services across the diocese. Many conservatives felt the response did not go far enough. It is important to note that this real, genuine, heartfelt offer of welcome to LGBTQ people by straight members of the church was truly inspirational and motivational in a period of real danger and uncertainty for LGBTQ individuals. This brought together a genuinely supportive and mixed community where on a Sunday morning with 100 people present for services, 20 would be openly LGBTQ. This was really unheard of at the time because the mainline churches in the 70s and 80s, continuing into the 90s, actively sought to exclude openly LGBTQ individuals from the grace of communion and active participation in the church. John Seeley remembers, what I needed to know was I was loved and I was okay. I wasn't evil or degenerate or sinful. I am a unique, beloved child of God. I still believe it is important that others hear and receive that message. During the 90s, members of Memorial began marching in some of the first pride parades in Baltimore.
The new millennium brought new leadership to Memorial with Reverend Martha McGill as rector. A year or so after her appointment, Martha called Stuart Lucas as an associate priest. Stuart was finishing seminary and excited to begin his first call. He was also excited to marry his husband, Doug, at St. Thomas Church in DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C. The Standing Committee of the Diocese of Atlanta refused to ordain Stuart if he and Doug went through with the wedding ceremony. A group of Memorial members, including Alma Bell, John Payne, Jesse Milan Jr., and Nancy Kelso, called the Bishop of Maryland to ensure that Stuart's canonical residence was transferred to the Diocese of Maryland, so he was allowed to be ordained and serve at Memorial beginning in June 2001. Suffragan Bishop John Rabb ordained Stuart to the priesthood at Memorial Episcopal Church. The ushers prepared for protests over ordaining the first openly gay man in the diocese, but their only challenge ended up being finding enough seats for all those who gathered to celebrate. Following his ordination, the pair set up a committee to study how to begin blessing gay relationships at Memorial. Following a period of planning and discernment, Doug Hoffman and George Weltz's union was blessed at Memorial in October 2003. There were a number of other blessings that year and the years that followed, each a small act of resistance, as it was still against diocesan and national canons to affirm same-sex marriages. The Reverend Stuart Lucas recalls being on the clergy retreat that year, waiting for the story to come out in the paper and wondering what the blowback was going to be. As before, the response from the diocese and the larger church was mixed. That same summer, the General Convention accepted the ordination of the first openly gay bishop in the church, the Right Reverend Gene Robinson. But they rejected a call for common liturgy for the blessing of same-sex unions. Not all memorial members wanted to wait, and Jesse Milan and Bill Roberts were legally married in 2008 in California, with many members of Memorial sending flowers and love and prayers across the country.
In 2012, the state of Maryland voted to make same-sex marriage legal. Shortly thereafter, 2 parishioners had a marriage service. Nora Adams and Mary Goodwin came to Memorial to have their marriage blessed by the Reverend Martha McGill. In 2013, 2 couples, Louise Miller and Nancy Kelso, and Paul Seaton and John Seeley were both legally married at Memorial, among the first couples to be legally married in the state of Maryland.
When asked to describe what it meant to him to be so loved and lifted up by Memorial, Stuart Lucas said that he was forever grateful for that, and that Memorial was, and still is, a community that will do everything it can to make sure that you are loved.
The work, of course, is never over. Since 2016, Memorial has hosted regular services on Trans Day of Remembrance, only interrupted by COVID. We have LGBTQ+ staff members and parishioners who are fully active and involved in the life and ministry of Memorial. We have marched in many Baltimore Pride parades since the 1990s, and last year we held our first celebration of the National Day of Prayer for LGBTQ+ youth. We are continuously partnering with LGBTQ+ organizations and leaders in our community and beyond to ensure that Memorial is always learning, growing, and able to welcome others. We will continue to work in large and small ways to be that same community of welcome and love that began this work more than 50 years ago.
I would just like to add a coda to the story of Memorial. I've been a priest in the Episcopal Church since 1972, so I have lived through all of that in the church. I lived through being very quiet about who I was. I lived through what was called the Port St. Lucie Statement in the late 70s, in which the bishops affirmed that being homosexual was not compatible with Christian teaching, and certainly there would be no homosexual, no gay clergy. But things, in fact, were moving. There were more and more gay people around and in the church. I served at St. John's Lafayette Square, one of the toniest churches in the Episcopal Church, often thought of as the Republican Party at prayer. Not really so, but thought of that. We had a remarkable number of gay and lesbian members. And of course, the 80s came, and many of them were afflicted with HIV and died. That parish surrounded them with love. The rector's wife would often go visit and bring things to them. The 90s took me to St. Thomas Parish, about which you've just heard, a mostly gay parish, not a gay parish, that's exclusive, but more people there were gay than weren't. And we engaged in a lot of study and talk about the blessing of same-sex unions. I can remember an old lady from Montgomery, Alabama, saying, "Can't we stop talking about this and just do it?" So we did move ahead. I had the pleasure of officiating at Stuart and Doug's wedding at St. Thomas the day after he graduated from seminary, in the presence of the dean of the Virginia Seminary, lots of faculty members, parents of Stuart and Doug who were thrilled and supportive. It was a great celebration, and we put it in the marriage register. It wasn't legal, of course, but we did it anyway, and I went on to do that with several other couples. And here I wound up in Baltimore, and as you just heard, marriage became legal, and so it was my great pleasure to go to Stuart and Doug's living room and officiate at a legal wedding, and to send word to the rector at St. Thomas to please annotate the marriage register. Lots has happened in the 2010s. The numbers of gay and lesbian clergy has exploded. The rectors of parishes which you thought would never have a gay rector do. Gay bishops, they're not the majority by any means, but there are more than a few, including Mary Glasspool, who came from Maryland. So things have changed. But as we read the newspapers, there is strong work in this country to turn things back. There is talk of maybe not recognizing gay marriage anymore. I don't think that will happen. Trans people are under enormous pressure. State legislatures are doing horrible things. So, as Paul said to us in 2 Corinthians, we have to get on with the work. We have to finish the work. But I myself am grateful to the witness of Memorial Church. My first time here was for Stuart's ordination, and I've been here a fair amount since then. And I do believe Memorial makes a witness to the inclusive nature of the church, to the inclusive nature of God, who wraps us all in his loving arms, in God's loving arms. So thank you, Memorial. Thank you who continue to be a part of the work of Memorial. And now let us walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, an offering and sacrifice to God.